All right, today we're going to talk about some other topics dealing with the criminal justice system. And the first one we're going to talk about are bail bonds. And what bail bonds are, where if you're arrested, then you leave some property or some money in order to ensure that you're going to appear in court. So if the system of putting money or property in exchange for temporary release pending a trial has been around for a long time. It's actually been around in at least to 13th century England. If we're looking at, just a brief history, we could look at 13th century England. And what you do is so you're arrested, and now you're supposed to appear in court. So what's to ensure that if they let you go, because you haven't had your trial yet, what's to ensure that if they let you go, that they say, okay, you're supposed to appear in court in 3 weeks, that you're actually going to show up there, right? Or if you're just going to leave town, or if you're just going to, you forgot or whatever. So when you're arrested, before you go to court, what happens is that you leave property. And if you don't show up in court, then you don't get your property back. So this is an incentive for you to get back and actually show up. And it's been around in the United States really since the country's founding. Now, over time, there are, different states have different laws on what bail bond is about, and we'll talk more about this, about a movement away from cash bonds to other mechanisms to try to ensure that you show up in court. But over time, these sort of addressed the idea of what is the fitness of the bail to fit the crime. For example, Paul Manafort, his bail was $1 million. Whereas the idea would be if you committed a minor crime, then you'd have a lower bail. And so trying to connect the bail up with the seriousness of the crime. So let me just give you a few comments that we'll talk about, because there's been some recent changes in the way in states that are looking at whether they're actually going to have cash bonds or not. So how it works is, for most people, we'll just some comments here, is that you have private bail companies. And the way a private bail company is a bail bond agent. So let's say you're arrested and charged with you're charged with stealing from stealing a pack of cigarettes from I don't know, one of these places downtown, Hillsdale or whatever. Okay, so. Well, they say, okay, the judge says, okay, you are to show up in 3 weeks, and it's going to be a $5,000 bail, okay? Now, you may not have the $5,000. In fact, most people don't put up the amount of the bail. What happens is you hire a private bail agency, and they put the bail up. And then you pay, usually the private bail agencies, they charge 10%. And it's non-refundable. You're basically getting a short-term loan. So that let's say they charge you and it's let's say a $5,000 bail. What you'll do is you'll pay the bail agency $500, and then they'll put up the other $4,500. And if you don't show up, then they have to pay. And so they will then try to go out and make sure that you do show up because they're out the money if you don't. So generally it's a 10% bail bond, and there's again, it's non-refundable. So it's a penalty then, even if you're not guilty, right? Because you've paid the $5,000, you've paid the $500 in order to get the bail bonds folks to put up the $5,000, so you don't have to stay in jail until your court case shows up. And that's the thing, is that if you don't post bail, then you have to then you're held in jail. Okay. So in order to not have to be in jail until your court case shows up, you got to pay the bail bond. Now, so that's a first sort of comment, is that private bail companies are the way that it mostly works. But because it's non-refundable, there's basically a penalty even if you're not guilty. Right, because you will have paid the bail bondsman the fee, so that you're not held in jail until your court case shows up 2 weeks from now. And then when you show up, and let's say you're found not guilty, okay? If you're found not guilty, you still ended up having to pay the bail bondsman, right? So this is because you had to pay the bond bailsman. Now, the bond bailsmen serve a purpose in the sense, again, we're looking at benefits and costs, right? They serve a purpose in that you don't have to remain in jail until your court case shows up. So you're able to leave and go back to, let's say you had a job as a waitress in a local restaurant, okay? You can go back to your job. And so that makes it so that more people cannot have to stay in jail until their court case shows up. But there is a penalty in a sense in that you had to pay for that even if you weren't found guilty. So that's just a cost to the bail, a cash bail situation. Secondly, as a second observation, is that it's usually, cash bail is usually set by a formula. And that has to do with the severity of the crime. So that for a minor crime, then you might not have a very large bail, and for a major crime you have a large bail. But notice that it is unrelated to your ability to pay. So actually there was a recent survey done that showed that by the Census Bureau that showed that most people can't afford a more than $400 surprise cost. So let's say you are low income, even $1,000 bail could stretch it so that you don't have the money to do that. So that what you can see what's going to happen is that there's going to be a variance amongst socioeconomic group on whether they can post the bail. And what is the point here. The point is that low-income people are more likely to not be able to post bail, right? They may not even be able to afford the 10% that they'd have to pay the bail bondsman. And so if you're Paul Manafort, you may be able to write out a check for your $1 million and you're out the door. But if you were a low-income person and they gave and the formula for whatever you were charged with, and remember here is that you're going to be held in jail until your court date, so that even if you're not guilty, you're having to spend time in jail. This will happen more to low-income people than it will to upper-income people. And so there's cash bail has a certain socioeconomic issue to it, in that if we didn't have, or if you could make the bail depend on your ability to pay, and say, that's one way that you could deal with this, is you could make it depend on your ability to pay. But that's not generally how cash bail is set. There's a place called the prisonpolicy.org. If you want to go look at, again, if you want to look at things to do your paper on, or if you're just more interested in this, and prisonpolicy.org, they estimate that about 536,000 people are being held in jails. About 536,000 people are held in jails in the U.S. because they can't afford bail or can't afford a bail bondsman, right? They're held in jail because they can't afford this bail or a bail bondsman. So that's a lot of people, right? And about 70% of the people that are in jail, this is prisonpolicy.org, they estimate that about 70% of people in jail have yet to be convicted or sentenced. So there's a whole lot of people that are in jail that are there, according to prisonpolicy.org, about 70% of people in jail have not been convicted or sentenced. So that's a significant problem, right? There's, again, if we're looking at the marginal social cost and marginal social benefit, right? It's, let's, talk about that then as sort of an observation. If, a third sort of comment, right? There's a marginal social cost to this. And we have to think about what that marginal social cost might be. First of all, that you might lose your job because you can't get to work. All right? Because you lose your job because you can't get to work. Again, let's take the example of you are a waitress at a local restaurant, and you get arrested for something, and let's say you are not guilty, but your let's say bond is set at $10,000. You don't have the $1,000 to pay a bail bondsman, so you have to sit in jail for the 2 weeks until your court case comes up, and you can't show up for work. And it may be that that one of the aspects of your job is if you don't show up to work, then they're going to just hire somebody else. They can't, the local restaurant can't afford to have you just, have their waitress or waiter or whatever not show up for work. So again, that's a cost, and again, we can sort of think about all the costs that we talked about earlier about holding people when we were talking about incarceration, right? There's all the costs to holding the people, right? To have jails, have more jails larger than they otherwise would be, pay the attendants and the food and everything else, all those other costs that we talked about if you were to hold people in jail. I forgot to mention in the prior section there, we were talking about that different socioeconomic groups. It turns this prison policy did a survey, and they found that more than half of those held because they couldn't make bail are parents of children less than 18. So let's go sort of back to what we were just talking about, that half of the people held because they couldn't make bond have children under the age of 18. And what does that do? That affects family structure, right? You got a single mom with 2 kids, and now she's got to, has to stay in jail until her court case shows up. That's going to be costly for the family. How is that family structure going to work? Or even if it's, it's a 2-parent family, one of the adults is now not able to watch the children or whatever, and so you can see that there's a socioeconomic cost to that as well. There's a thing called the Bail Project. Going back to what this third point about just looking at the marginal social cost of just holding people. If you want to look for a source of information, the Bail Project reports that we're adding more to the jail population by people held without bail than incarceration. Again, this is something that you might want to look at. I didn't go into a large data search on this. But it's something to, again, if the point here is, of course, that we keep making the point, is that you're trying to look at what's the marginal social cost of this legal structure and what's the marginal social benefit. And if this is correct, if the Bail Project survey is correct, then you're saying, okay, when we were looking at incarceration and we were looking at the marginal social cost of that, maybe you're adding a whole lot of people to the jail population, whether it is more than what's happening because people have just been arrested and convicted, right? It's still a cost that you need to think of and then look at what the marginal social benefit of that is. Another comment is that will people plead guilty to a lesser offense in order to get out of jail, right? So again, it depends on what the delay is between the time that you are arrested and when your court case comes up. If it's a day, if you were to, one of the things that you could do to reduce this problem would be to make it so that there's lots and lots of courts and lots of prosecutors and lots of defense attorneys so that everybody could get once you're arrested, you could get out the next day, right? Well, that's not the way it's working, because that would have enormous administrative costs, right? So the point here, though, is that will people plead guilty to a lesser offense to get out of jail? So if you are in a state, or you're in a county, or you're a place where there is a shortage of prosecuting attorneys, there's a shortage of judges, there's a shortage of that, so that if there's a long delay between when you're arrested and when you come up for your court case, if that's happening, then and you can't post bail, you may plead guilty to a lesser crime in order to just get out of jail, right? You say, okay, I'll accept this. I've been in here for 2 weeks. I'm going to accept this sentence of 2 weeks rather than, I don't know, I've got another 2 weeks until my court date, and I'm going to be sitting here, and then I'm going to have to pay an attorney, or even if I don't have to pay an attorney, I have the legal counsel provided by the government. How do I know when we're thinking about expected values, expected returns, I got to think, okay, what's the chances that I'm going to be found guilty even though I'm not? You may just say, okay, I'm going to plead to a lesser charge just in order to get out of jail. Now, the issue of bail reform is not a new issue, right? That is, in fact, I'm going to read you a quote here. Right? This is not a new issue. And this is a quote from 1964 from Robert Kennedy, who at the time was the Attorney General of the United States. And here's a direct quote from him. He says, what has been made clear today in the last 2 days is that our present attitudes towards bail are not only cruel, but really completely illogical. What has been demonstrated here is that usually only one factor determines whether a defendant stays in jail before he comes to trial. That factor is not guilt or innocence. It is not the nature of the crime. It is not the character of the defendant. The factor is simply money. How much money does the defendant have? This was at the 1964 National Conference on Bail and Criminal Justice, where, again, Attorney General Robert Kennedy was speaking. And so, this issue's been around for a long time, right? And, it's again, all these issues don't have a straight answer, right? And it'll depend on the circumstance, right? That's the whole, point of, or a major point of what we've been talking about, is that let's look at it, let's think through, maybe we can't exactly measure the marginal social benefit, or we can't exactly measure the marginal social cost, but we may say, you know what? It's pretty clear in this particular instance that the marginal social cost of whatever we're doing is greater than the marginal social benefit of whatever we're doing. Recently, so not much had really happened, but recently New Jersey and New York have significantly scaled back the use of cash bail. So this has come to the forefront in recent years, and New Jersey and New York have significantly reduced reliance on cash bail. And using other methods as an alternative to try to get people to make sure that they show up in court. Interestingly, that in November 2020, California had a referendum on a bill that had passed, right? on a bill that had passed. So, you know, what a referendum does is it allows you have a vote of the people to see if what the legislature had passed and been signed into law would remain in effect. Okay? So there's a 2018 piece of legislation in California that would have ended cash bail. And it stopped the law in November of 2020. The referendum stopped the law that would have eliminated cash bail. And interestingly, there were two sides that came together that resulted in the referendum passing that made it so that that law did not take effect. On the one side, as you might expect, that the pro-referendum people, that is, the people who wanted to eliminate the law that would have eliminated cash bail. They wanted to basically restore cash bail. One side that you expect was the bail bond agencies, right? They supported, so they were the pro-referendum folks. They supported the restoration of cash bail. But also, there was a group that argued that this would give too much power to judges. And they thought that this would be a racially divisive. That is that it gives too much discretion, and there's more racial bias would happen in the judges determining what you had to do in order to make it so that you didn't, if you failed to show up, then bad things would happen to you, right? So that it was sort of an interesting combination of folks that got together on that. So this just happened in January of 2020. This happened in the November election. And what it did was, again, November of this year, overturned the elimination of cash bail. By the one side that normally is arguing for the elimination of cash bail often argues that there's, as we were talking about, the socioeconomic problem, and this tends to be more racially. It has a more effect on the black population than it is on the white population, and so these same folks there was a break in folks that were concerned about the racial bias that might happen under a cash bail system. They thought that it gave too much discretion to the judges about whether, what was the alternative to cash bail to ensure that you show up in court. So again, that leads us to another point. How do you ensure that people show up in court? Right? Suppose that you get rid of cash bail. Right? Cash bail has this drawback, several drawbacks. Right? It has several drawbacks in that if you can't post it, then you may end up in jail even though you were not convicted of a crime. And so what can you do to create an alternative situation where people actually do show up, right? We didn't just arrest you for doing something and then your court date is 3 weeks from now and you leave town, right? You just never show up, right? And then there's going to be all this cost to try and find you. And so, again, there's these trade-offs. So how do you ensure that people show up? What are some alternatives? These are alternatives to the cash bail system. We'll call this and of course, when we were talking about the social cost of imprisonment back earlier on, right? We talked about GPS systems, right? Where people have some GPS system attached to their ankle or whatever. So when we were talking about rather than incarcerate you, we were saying that what we would do is, and keep it so you couldn't keep your job, what we could do is we could put some sort of GPS tracking on you so we know where you are all the time, and then we'll know that you went to work or whatever, and so that reduced the marginal social cost of incarcerating people. But all we're doing here is talking about incarcerating people as well. We're just talking about incarcerating them prior to their conviction. So that's certainly an alternative, right? A GPS system to do that. It turns out that they're in Washington, D.C., they have a pretrial services agency, okay? They have a pretrial services agency, okay? So you've been arrested. Say, okay, your court date is, 3 weeks from now. And what they do is this uses a risk assessment tool for bail. That is, what you do is you have this formula, and it says, okay, what's the probability that this person's not going to show up, right? I mean, that's what you're trying to deal with. Is this person not going to show up? Well, let's say that, and this will have a whole formula that they've used, looked at this data, and they find that, okay, with this type of crime, shoplifting, this person has, they're employed, et cetera, et cetera. So you put this data in and you say, okay, what's the risk that they're not going to show up? Okay. If the risk is very low, then we say, okay, we'll just put a tracking system on you, or we'll just say, we're going to assume that you're going to show up, right? And then what they do is they have caseworkers that visit the arrested person, right? That is the person that was arrested. So they have caseworkers, and they people are released on what's called released on their own recognizance. Okay, that means you're released without bail, right? Released on their own recognizance. So they have these caseworkers go and visit the people and make sure that, let's say they were arrested on because they had, for possession of crystallized methamphetamines or something like that, right? So they'll have caseworkers that go up and visit them and make sure that they're not on drugs, and et cetera. And it turns out that 90% of all the people in this Washington, D.C. program actually show up in court. On their court date. So it's pretty effective in not having a bail and still getting people to be released on their own recognizance, and then they show up in court. Okay? What's the issue? Well, the issue is, as we might expect from been talking here, it's very expensive. You have to pay these these counselors, and you have to have you have to have people generating the formula for the risk assessment, et cetera. And so it's a very expensive system. But what's the marginal social benefit of it? The marginal social benefit is there's lots of people that are in jail right now that actually are just awaiting their court date and have never been convicted of the crime, and that's very costly as well, right? So you have to weigh again the benefits and the cost. So what's the marginal social cost, or is it greater than or less than the marginal social benefit of having this program? So in general then, cash bail is, again, just an interesting topic. Whether we should have it or whether it's been around since the 13th century. It's been around in the United States since the founding. And so there must be some sort of benefit to it, in that it ensures that people show up when their court date is. The alternatives to, of course, then it has these marginal social costs to it, and we've just talked about people having to spend time in jail even when they weren't convicted of the crime, and all these other costs that they lose their job, or they have trouble taking care of their kids, or et cetera. So again, it's a matter of trying to think through, maybe in this particular instance, it is better to not have cash bail. And like I said, in the 1964 National Conference on Bail and Criminal Justice, Robert Kennedy was talking about this. And it's interesting to look at some of the analysis of this recent November 2020 referendum in California that repealed the bill, repealed the law, or didn't let the law go into effect, kept the law from going into effect that had been passed by the legislature that would have eliminated cash bail. So again, it's a topic where there's not a clear answer at any particular point, but to give you guidance on, in this situation, cash bail, the marginal social benefit of the cash bail is less than the marginal social cost, and so maybe we ought to seek other alternatives. But again, the other alternatives may be expensive as well. I suppose a question that we hadn't talked about, but you might think about is will people show up anyway, right? Will people show up for their court date anyway? What percentage of people will just abscond, and they will have committed the crime, and they committed the crime, but they were never suffered the penalty for it. So again, just an interesting topic to think about. All right. The next thing to talk about is recent controversies over policing. Recent controversy over policing. That is, you probably are familiar with the demonstrations that were the Black Lives Matter movement that happened. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is the National Conference of Mayors in August of 2020 had released a report. National Conference of Mayors in 2020, they released a report. And what this report was about a compact between the police and the community, and it was it's a compact between between the police and the community that they serve, right? That's the idea. And their idea was that the legitimacy of the police depends on or derives from public consent and trust. That is, if you don't trust the police, then they're not going to be very effective in deterring crime, right? I mean, again, going back to this issue of can I spend more money changing P of X, right? Or should I spend more money on F of X? How effective is the police force in reducing the probability of your being convicted of a crime once you have undertaken that, when you're thinking about undertaking that crime from a rational criminal perspective. So their point is that there's a compact, that we should have a compact between the police and the community. And what are some of the points of this compact? What they call the principles of this compact. I need to put a question mark there. Well, just say what they are. The first of these is redefining the role of the police and public safety. Redefining the role of police and public safety. And the issue here is who's best equipped to be the first responder to a calls for service. That is, the situation is that police are often thrust into situations where they're not the best prepared. So just as an example, suppose you got somebody that's got a mental illness, right? And somebody, they're threatening someone or something like that, and you call the police, and the policeman shows up, or the police officer shows up, and the police officer is not trained in mental illness, and so what you really need is somebody there that has a skill in that social need, a skill in dealing with people who are mentally ill and being able to calm them down or do something like that. So the others, there are social service needs that people call the police for, and then they show up, and the idea is that perhaps you should be calling somebody else. And in fact, in New York, the mayor recently announced plans to divert money from the nation's largest police force to social services, right? So that just New York City mayor just recently announced that they're going to divert money from police to other social services. And so the idea would be that you would call the other social services rather than the police department to show up when there's a situation that needs to be diffused. Sometimes you hear about this, defund the police movement. Well, what they're really, mainly this is what they're really talking about. They're talking about saying, okay, we're having our police show up to do things that they're maybe not well trained for, or they're not the proper agency to really be dealing with this, and people don't know about that. And so what we're going to try to do is make it so that people are aware of this is the agency that you need to call. And so it's really a movement of funds away from the police to other social services agencies that are more appropriate for the problem at hand. Second principle was trust and legitimacy. And again, you can look up the National Conference of Mayors Compact and get more detail on this. But basically, the police, the idea is that the police have to earn the community's trust and cooperation, right? That the police will earn the trust and cooperation of the community. So you need to have programs where the police will interact with the community before a crisis occurs, and that the public has to respect the police, right? That is the so that if you're a City of Detroit police department, then you're going to want to try to train your police or may have them interact within the community in order to have your schools teach children to respect the police and how important the police are in terms of reducing the amount of crime in their area. And so the idea then is to have a constructive interaction between the police and the community on both sides, and that they also suggest that the supervisors be held accountable for actions of the people that they're supervising. So if one of the police officers beats somebody up that they shouldn't have, then the supervisor will be held responsible as well, right? For actions of those they supervise. This looks like vicarious liability, right? When we were talking about tort law and we were talking about vicarious liability, could you be held accountable for the actions of someone else, then you'll behave in a different way. A third thing is, a third principle that the National Conference of Mayors held in their report is the sanctity of life. And the sanctity of life then really just says, okay, don't use excessive force, right? And restrain other officers if they're going to. That is, if you are a partner with a police officer and that police officer is using excessive force, then you should take action to restrain what that officer is doing. A fourth one is equality and due process. Equality and due process. And what they mean by equality of due process is that be aware of racial discrimination, right? That is, and certainly that could be a problem, right? And that you should, again, take action against it. Right? Should make it so that there is to try to eliminate racial discrimination in the police force. And of course, there's a lot of, recently there's been a lot of discussion about that as well, Okay? So that was one of the, again, one of the principles of this, of the National Conference of Mayors Compact. The fifth thing is community. And this is related. This is related to the trust and legitimacy principle. But the idea is that the officer should have respectful engagement in the community. And interestingly enough, there's an organization called Hey Blue, if you want to look that up. And what this was a, well, what this is in 2016, a former New York City police officer that had moved to Florida. In 2016, he started this organization to integrate the police with the community. To integrate the police with the community. And it's sort of interesting, his name is John Verdi, if you want to look up some of this. And the reason that I saw this, it was on NBC News last night, and it was talking about this organization, and now it's gone nationwide. It is, and what it does is the police go into schools, and they go in and they read to the third graders. Or they, they have little programs where they maybe, dance with the kindergartners. Or, but the point being that to get the schools integrated into this idea that the police are there to be a resource, but also that the police are there because they're friends with you. And notice that if that happens, then you're more likely to help out. If there is a crime, you try to help the police out to go find the person that did it. You don't feel threatened by the police. And so there's again, this is sort of an interesting nationwide movement that has been around since 2016, but it was on, they were talking about it on the NBC Nightly News, and they were talking about how they're having to switch over to to Zooming with the kids rather than actually being in the classroom with them. But again, it's sort of an interesting thing that you might want to take a look at. All right, what we're going to do for the final lecture is we'll go ahead and finish this the point here on this police controversy over policing. Again, you've seen in the news the Black Lives Matter and stuff, but it turns out that that's actually an organization that's been around since 2013, 2014, and we'll talk more about that. And that will then conclude what we have for the law and economics. Again, I didn't think that we were going to be able to get into the 2 chapters on the economics of the institutions, but you can read that on your own if you like. I won't have anything on the exam about that.